In the 1940s and 50s, when cars really started hitting the masses, we started to see a focus on driver engagement and involvement. You were encouraged more and more to use the automobile. It was post-war, and we had the resources to continue to use them. Over time, what we saw was an emphasis on that engagement, the craftsmanship. Everything you touched, felt, and turned had to be perfect, and if it wasn't, you weren't paying for it, i.e. Cadillac. They were the top of the world in the 40s and 50s, and you could tell. But there were always two paths to take as an automaker. Make something cheap and available, or make something expensive and exclusive. You could always go for the more technical route, making something expensive because it did something nothing else did, or make something expensive because it was made well. All of these cars, though they were rather primitive, were made well, and we're seeing this resurgence again today, but it needs to move a little bit faster. Today, I'm going to be discussing why. To get to the bottom of this, I'll be bringing up a company that you might know something about, Toyota. Toyota doesn't implement a technology into its cars until it can safely say that the technology is ready. It will test, and continue to test for years on end. And this is why people say that Toyota is behind the curve. But I would argue the opposite. They know that what their consumers want is reliability and consistency. Every gimmick and gadget that you put into a consumer's hand on the interior of a vehicle is an opportunity for distraction, especially when it's something brand new. If it's unfamiliar, people will want to look at it and they will want to play with it. But the problem is you cannot have distractions in a new car. And this is the problem I have with today's cars. There are too many distractions. Nothing is familiar anymore because everyone's trying to set themselves apart. And instead of setting themselves apart for build quality, they do it through gimmicks. Every automaker now is building in an AV system, or driver assist system. These are great when they work. But the problem is people don't realize how often they do not work. This can create a false sense of security that I don't have to pay attention because the car will stop itself if it needs to. I argue that that should not be up to the car. The car is, at the end of the day, an object. As much as car guys like to personify their vehicles, we understand that the car cannot act on itself. It needs to be driven by a human. Human drivers will never be replaced. And we have something that's called an understanding of object. A human driver has a better understanding of what the vehicle is capable of than a robot can. A robot would see a stick lying in the road and decide that it needs to stop. But this is not an option if you are on a highway. You will cause a pileup. And although that vehicle was doing what it's intended to do, avoid obstacles, it's creating an obstacle of itself. The driver is still in control of the vehicle, and yet people want to pretend that's not the case. Driver assist systems are not the only culprits and can often be helpful. Things like lane keep assist and blind spot monitoring is always good, but it just has to be used knowing that it is a faulted system. You should always be in control. The other culprit I will pin onto touchscreens. Touchscreens in vehicles are a terrible idea. The screens themselves are not the problem. It's what's on them that's the problem. A touchscreen is great when it assists you in what you need to do, but what you should be able to do is put something on it, and the rest of the controls are available to you at any time. Anything that you are accessing regularly, climate control, window switches, door locks, things of that nature should never be on the touchscreen, especially things that are driver-centered. The driver should always have their main focus be driving. And this is the biggest problem I have with all of these EV startups, because it's very cheap to install a large tablet and program in all the functions that I just listed. In fact, in some of the vehicles that I drove when I worked at a dealership, the seat heaters were on the screen. The human brain is also very good at identifying shapes. What I could do in many older vehicles and vehicles meant for work was things like looking at the buttons before I start driving, recognize which ones are which, and then I could just reach over and turn them or press them as the time went on. I didn't need to look away from the road. I didn't even need to know where they were exactly. I could feel around until I found the right button. But that's not the case with a touchscreen. You can't just feel around until you find the right button, because the whole screen is one 2D texture. You should never have to do something like go through menus to find your air conditioning. The air conditioning should be easily accessible. You should never have to look through any menus to find any essential functions of your vehicle. All of that should be laid out in front of you. That's what frustrates me about these touchscreens. Everything that I like about my vehicle right now is that things are mechanical, they are hardwired, and they cannot be changed. This is not to say that I hate EVs. I actually don't. I enjoyed my time with several of them. But what I'd like to see is a return to mechanics. Toggle switches, buttons, things that are familiar, simplicity, and elegance. The simplicity of a plug-and-play system, as the manufacturers would like to lead you believe, is that you can play with the interiors. When I think of EVs now, I think of cars like the Corvette and the Dodge Viper. Their shape was necessitated by their large displacement motors. But when you have such small, compact motors, you can play around a little bit. You can make interesting, unique shapes. My point in saying all of this is that you don't have to make a touchscreen the appealing point of an EV. The appealing point of an EV can be its shape, it can be its power plant, and it can be its suspension. Look at the Porsche Taycan. Whether Tesla fans want to admit it or not, the Porsche Taycan does something that other EVs can't. It has a 2-speed gearbox. Its thermal management can move heat and cooling around at any point in time. Porsche knows exactly how to build a car, and they aren't going to jump on something before they know they can do it precisely well. When EVs first started popping up, their appeal was their whimsy. Programmed in were these weird Jetsons modes and things like that that made them kind of silly. But now there are serious competitors. We should always remember that driving is one of the greatest privileges we have as people. The ability to hop in a car and go wherever, whenever we want is incredible. The more we give that up, the more we start to feel dependent on companies, and the more those private companies can take advantage of you. This is not to scare you. This is not to alert you. This is to remind you to enjoy the things you have now, because that future could be any day. Enjoy driving while you still can. Be safe, have fun, and don't take anything for granted.